What's up? Joey here. I know, not EJ. Surprise, surprise, plot twist. So this is a bonus lesson that we decided to include to give you a little bit of an overview about animation principles. Now, animation principles, there's a lot of them. And animation is a very deep topic. We actually have entire courses at School of Motion dedicated just to the art of creating beautiful movement. But in this course, EJ's already taught you a few things about how to create animation in Cinema 4D. What I want to do is show you a few principles, sort of the 80-20 rule of animation principles, to give you some things to think about, play with, and try on your next project. And it's going to make your movement so much more satisfying the very first time you try these things. If you do want to go deeper, check out the other courses we have, like Animation Bootcamp. But for now, let's jump in and look at some examples of different types of animation. And I'm going to point out a few things that I'm then going to go into Cinema 4D and show you how to execute. So what you're seeing on screen here is the School of Motion Manifesto video that was made by Ordinary Folk. Now, this shot and the first half of the video, more or less, is done in 2D using mostly After Effects. There's a little bit of traditional animation as well. But there's also a lot of 3D elements in this piece, and those were created in Cinema 4D and then composited inside of After Effects. So you can see there's a lot going on, and I want to focus on this shot, this one right here where you've got these two characters kind of assembling themselves in this cool way up at the top of this pile. You got a little Wacom pen here. Now there's a lot going on, and that's typically going to be the case whenever you're doing, really high-end work. You're going to be using 3D, 2D, you're going to be mixing and matching things, and you've got all these different elements that need to move in a coordinated fashion. And so that's where knowing how to animate, knowing animation principles comes in very, very handy. So I want to take a look at the shot and point out a few things. So the first thing I want you to notice is just the way the speed seems to change here, okay? Now, one of the many things Ordinary Folk is very good at is creating contrast in their movement. So you have very slow movements followed by very fast movements, and this back and forth creates contrast. Contrast is a really important principle in design, but also in animation. So notice how we're moving really, really fast and then slow down. Now that's a little bit of a gradual speed change, but look at this right here. Boom, this little burst when everything kind of flies up in the air. Let me play that section again. Right here, you'll notice that everything picks up speed in a really nice, natural way. And then once everything settles, you get this nice kind of calm moment. And the key principle at play here when you're talking about creating contrast with animation, well, there's actually two of them. There's timing and there's spacing. We're going to talk about both of them in a moment, but all you need to know is that timing is what it sounds like. It's how long does an action take? How much time does a specific action take? If you throw a ball up and then it comes down, how long does it take for that to happen? That's the timing. Spacing, though, is more important and it's more subtle. And spacing you can think of in a lot of cases as how is the thing accelerating and decelerating? And there is a lot that you can play with there to give you very different feels in your animation. So one more time, watch this scene and just look at how everything moves at a slightly different speed, and there's fast moments and there's slow moments, and it creates this nice sense of contrast. The next shot I want you to look at is this one right here, and it's a really subtle thing, but it adds a lot. Notice how when this group of windows sort of opens up, I want you to watch what they do. I'm going to play this again and look right where my mouse is. So this slides up and then it pushes back to the left before pushing to the right. Now, EJ has already mentioned the idea of anticipation to you. If something's going to move to the right, you maybe want it to move to the left for a second before and then push to the right. It kind of signals to the viewer, hey, look here, something's about to happen, and it feels more natural. And the other end of that, sort of the twin brother of that, is an overshoot, where something's moving to the right, but it doesn't just get there and stop. It goes a little too far and has to backpedal to get into the right position. And this gives things a more plausible sense of physicality. It makes it just feel more real. And our eyes are used to seeing reality. And so when we animate things in a way that, matches reality, it just tends to feel a little bit more correct. It feels better. In fact, this whole shot is filled with little moments of anticipations and overshoots and also timing and spacing. Now, I want you to look at this character's hair specifically. There's a lot of cool stuff going on, but notice how the hair rotates up and down to match what the head is doing. but it's doing it with a little bit of a lag, okay? And an easier way to visualize this is to just look at your arm and wave it up and down like this. So if I move my arm up and down from the elbow, right, my wrist doesn't just stay put. My wrist sort of moves with it, but there's a little bit of a lag. As my arm moves up, the wrist is still gonna be bent a little bit this way, right? It's lagging behind because of drag. And then once I stop moving my elbow, whoosh, this is gonna come up. It's gonna follow the motion of the sort of parent bone that it's attached to. And this principle is called follow through, or more commonly, overlapping action. You will see overlapping action absolutely everywhere now that you know it exists, and if you pay attention to it, you'll notice as these characters sort of pop up and down, their hair reacts, their arms react, all with a little bit of a lag. We're gonna link to this piece in the resources tab so you can watch the entire thing. It's amazing. I'm so proud of it. I still get goosebumps when I watch it. And it's really a masterclass in the application of animation principles, both in 2D and in 3D, and also in traditional cell animation. So now let's hop into Cinema 4D, and I'm gonna show you how you can start applying these principles and thinking about them inside of C4D. All right, so we have a simple little scene using some of the same elements that you may recognize from EJ's lesson. Now we've got some sliders here, and we've got this little contraption that I'm gonna talk about in a moment. But first, I just wanna talk about the basics of timing and spacing in Cinema 4D. So I have two cameras set up. Let's zoom into this so we can get a little closer look at these sliders. Now, each of these have a little keyframe icon that I can move left and right like this, okay? So we wanna animate these from the left to the right, starting with this first one. Now, one thing you will find out very quickly when you start using Cinema 4D is that every artist uses it slightly differently. The interface is super malleable, and you can dock windows in different places, and some people like working differently, and there's a million ways to do everything. I'm sure you're already learning that by taking this class. So I want you to know that the way you see me use Cinema 4D, probably different than the way EJ uses it, who uses it far more frequently than me, and for sure different than other artists, and maybe different than you like to use it. That's totally cool. What I'm talking about in this lesson are principles. So don't fixate too much on exactly how my window is set up, or which hotkeys I'm using, or where I'm going into the menu to get to a specific feature, because there's a million ways to do everything. So the first thing I wanna do is open up my dope sheet. So I'm gonna hit Shift F3 to open that. And here it is down here, okay? Now, I wanna talk about how I typically have my timeline set up, because when you're animating in Cinema 4D, it can get really, really crazy, and you wanna make sure that you have your filter set up and stuff like that. So here's typically what I have, and it'll be easier to see if I go right into the view menu. So I like to be in automatic mode most of the time. Automatic mode basically means that Cinema 4D's timeline is showing me only what I need to see, not absolutely every property that could be animated and may or may not be in every single object in my scene, even if there's no keyframes on it. So automatic mode means you can then set other parameters. Only show me things that have keyframes. Only show me things that are selected in my object manager. And this is really, really useful, especially as you get into busier and busier scenes. So I'm in automatic mode. And then if I come down into filter, you can see that I actually need to turn on animated only. I typically have that turned on because it just seems a little bit cleaner. And then I also have only object manager selection. Now, sometimes I will turn this off, and I probably will in this lesson, but for now, it's just gonna make it a little bit easier. So if I click off of my keyframe, you'll see it goes away from the dope sheet. If I click back on, now you can see that the position property is open. The only reason you're seeing the position property, by the way, is because I had keyframes on there and I deleted them before I started recording. So by default, you won't even see an object if there's no keyframes that have ever been put on it, because there's no animation track that's been created. That's the way Cinema 4D works. So first, let me show you how I typically put keyframes on things. And before I do that, let me make sure that I call out, if I hit Command D to bring up my project settings, I have the frames per second set to 24. And then you also need to remember to go into your render settings and set that frame rate to 24, so that if you render this, it's gonna match what you've animated. All right, so we're at frame 0 here. Notice that I have my play range set from frame 0 to frame 72. I'll be changing that a lot throughout this lesson. And the first thing I'm gonna do is make sure I'm on my first keyframe here. Let me click on it so I can bring it up in the attributes manager. And then I'm gonna go to coordinates. What I'm gonna be animating is the X position. So I like to hold Command and click on the keyframe, turn it red. Now in Cinema 4D, I typically don't use auto keying. And here's why. I find that when I have auto keying turned on, I typically forget that it's on. And if I'm playing around with something, if I move the camera accidentally, I've set a keyframe, and then I'm gonna have to go back and fix it, and I may have screwed up some animation curves. So because Cinema 4D has just so many buttons and it's so complicated, I really like to be very deliberate. So I typically leave auto keyframing off You don't have to though. You can work however you want. So if I want this to go from left to right over 1 second, I'm gonna click here to go to frame 24, and I can either grab the red handle here, or I can come over into the attributes manager. I'm just gonna move this over like this. Now notice, because I don't have auto keyframing turned on, no keyframe has been set. I need to manually come over here and option click, okay? And now you can see the keyframes in the dope sheet, and if I bring this back to frame 0 and hit spacebar, we now get playback. Now this is a pretty boring animation right now, and I'll show you why in a moment. But first, I wanna set my playback area to maybe 36 frames. And you can see now that I get this visual indicator. These are the only frames that are gonna be played when I hit spacebar, and I can loop that. Another thing I like to do a lot is click sort of in an empty space on the object manager, so then I get rid of that user interface. Makes it a little bit easier to see. So looking at this, I'm thinking, okay, this is really boring. There's not a lot of contrast. It's very bland, right? It does have an ease on it technically, so it speeds up, it gets going, and then it slows down a little bit before it stops. But it's just pretty flat and basic, right? So we wanna change that. How do we do that? Well, first, I wanna talk about the terminology again, okay? So notice that there are 24 frames of animation here. There's only 2 keyframes, and they take 1 second. This is the timing of this move, okay? Timing is the most basic animation principle. It's really easy to think about. How long does this movement take? It takes 1 second. The timing is 1 second. Now spacing, as I said, that's where it gets interesting. So how do we adjust spacing? To adjust spacing, you need to go into the F-curve editor. So you can either click this button here, or what I like to do is use the hotkey, which is tab. So if you hit tab, you can kind of toggle back and forth, and that's really, really handy. I'd like a little bit more space to mess with this graph. So what I can do is just move my mouse here until it changes shape, and then pull this up, get a little bit more room. Now you can see I've cropped out the bottom of this graph. So how can we adjust our view of this animation graph? Well, you can actually use the same hotkeys that you use to move around the viewport in Cinema 4D. So if you hold the 1 key on your keyboard, it will move around, and if you hold the 2 key, it will zoom in and out. Like this, I'm holding the 1 key and I'm clicking and moving around, and now if I hold the 2 key, I can move left and right to expand and contract, or I can go up and down to kind of change the scale here. The hotkey to make this whole thing a lot easier is H, which is gonna frame all. It will automatically scale and zoom so you can see everything sort of maximized in the window. This is great. So let's talk about what this graph is telling us. To get really good at animating on a computer, you need to understand graphs. That is basically the language every single animation app uses to control timing and spacing, which basically control everything else in animation. And it doesn't matter if it's Cinema 4D, if it's After Effects, if it's Rive, if it's Blender, it really doesn't matter. All graph editors, with some exceptions, work exactly the same way. Cinema 4Ds is pretty typical. So what is this graph telling me? Okay, well, so the y-axis is telling me the actual value at each keyframe. So if you look, if I hover over this, it says negative 261 centimeters. What the heck does that mean? That is the X position of the keyframe element at that frame, okay? And then on the horizontal axis, it's telling me what frame of animation we're on. So at frame 0, this is the value, and at frame 24, this is the value, negative 58, so it changes over time. How it changes over time is what we call spacing. So let me select these, and you can see there's some Bezier handles on them already, but what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna click on this little button here. This button will change the spacing to linear spacing, so let me do that. And lo and behold, we now have a straight line. So linear spacing is pretty obvious why it's called that. Linear spacing means that the rate of change between one value and another, between 2 keyframes, is linear. It doesn't change, so you have equal steps getting from the initial value to the end value. And that's typically pretty boring. Nothing in real life, and I mean nothing, actually moves that way. Now, in the world of computer animation, and especially motion design, sometimes you actually do want linear animation. For example, if you want a slow push in from a camera and you're cutting to that shot and you want the camera to already be moving, and then you're gonna cut before the camera stops, well, linear keyframes sometimes work very well for that. It feels like just a slow zoom or something like that. But for what we have going on here, that is not gonna feel natural. So if you've used After Effects, you may be familiar with the Easy Ease button. So if I select these keyframes and then I come over here, now I can use the easing setting. So you've got ease in, you've got easy ease, and you've got ease out here. I'm gonna click on easy ease, and you'll see we're back where we're started. What does easy ease actually do? Well, notice that what happened is at the beginning of the graph, it became flatter. And in the middle of the graph, it became steeper. And then at the end of the graph, it gets flatter again. So when you're reading an animation graph like this, all you need to remember is this mantra: steepness equals speed. So the steeper the graph, the faster the thing's moving. The flatter the graph, the slower it's moving. And if it's totally flat, that means it is not moving, it has stopped. And so watch what happens if I grab this Bezier handle and I move it around. I can change the shape of the graph. And if I hold Command while I do that, it will keep it basically flat on the graph like that, right? So I can't accidentally move it up and down like this. So I'm gonna pull this over much further. Then I'm gonna grab this Bezier handle, hold Command, and do the same thing and pull it this way. Now I want you to look at what I've done to the graph. It's much flatter here. It's much steeper here, and then it's much flatter here. Flat, steep, flat. Well, that sure sounds like contrast. So now I'm gonna play this animation and I want you to see how it feels. And I want you to really pay attention to the contrast between the slow and fast parts of the movement. There it is. So notice that now it's a lot more interesting looking. The keyframe is really slow at the beginning, but where my mouse is right in the middle, that is where it's moving the fastest. And then it slows down a lot at the end. It just gives it a lot of contrast. What if we exaggerated that even more? So let me select my keyframe again, and I'm gonna grab this keyframe, and this time I'm gonna zoom out. One of the cool things about Cinema 4D is just how extreme it will let you pull these Bezier handles. After Effects actually stops you from pulling the Bezier handle any further than the next keyframe. Well, Cinema 4D doesn't care. It'll let you go as far as you want to. So I'm gonna pull these both really extreme like this. Now, take a look at this. If we step frame by frame through this, notice how little movement is happening in these first few frames up here. And then when we get to this frame, boom, big jump, boom, big jump. And you can see the big jump visually in the steepness of the graph. Remember, steepness equals speed. So let me play this a few times for you. You notice how it feels like the keyframe almost teleports over there, just zips. It's so fast. And by the way, a little bit of a gotcha that you may run into. If you want to preview something that you're working on and your mouse is, say, over here on top of the object manager, if I hit space, it actually will not play the animation. Notice that when I do this, it's just alternating between different modes in the editor. If I move my mouse over the timeline and I hit space, now it will play the animation. And of course, it's only playing between frames 0 and 36. Cinema 4D has a lot of little gotchas like that. The window your mouse is over will actually affect the hotkeys that are active at that time. So just be aware of that. And if you hit space and it's not playing, it's probably because your mouse is in the wrong spot. So let's look at a few other ways you could adjust the spacing of this. So what if I grab this Bezier handle and I point it up like this and I pull this one back? So now if I hit H, you can see this whole thing. Let's think about what's happening here. There is no easing happening on this very first frame, right? So if I hit play, this thing immediately starts moving. Now it does ease to a stop, but then it just gets shot out of a cannon. So there are times when you actually don't want an ease on a keyframe. A good rule of thumb is if something's off screen and it's flying in from off screen, that first keyframe where the thing is not on screen yet, you don't want an ease on it. You want it to feel like it's already moving, and then when it gets to where it's gonna go, it can ease to a stop. And then of course there's the inverse of that, where if something's gonna be sort of, flying off the screen, you could invert this and actually have the ease at the beginning and have no ease at the end, and this is the kind of thing you're gonna get. Now, what do I actually want for this example? Well, I think what I want is a pretty typical easy ease situation. So I'm just gonna click back on this to reset it. And then I like a lot of contrast. So I'm gonna grab this handle and hold Command to make sure I don't accidentally move the handle around like this. And I don't know, I'm probably gonna pull it something like that. And there's just a lot of trial and error with this. So I'm gonna play it back. I think, that's okay, but it might be nice if there's a little bit more contrast, so I'll just put a little bit more in there. And that's typically what it looks like when I'm animating. I don't know any animator that gets it right the first time with animation curves, so don't expect that. Expect to be doing a lot of noodling and tweaking and playback and, fixing and stuff like that. Okay, so now we have got one of these little dials animated the way I like it. Great. So what else could we do to make this a little bit more interesting? Well, we could add an anticipation and we could add an overshoot. And these are two sides of the same coin. And as you'll see, it makes things a lot more interesting. So instead of having the keyframe just sort of start moving and then stop, I want it to feel, a little bit more rickety, a little bit more imperfect, okay? So here's how we're gonna do that. I'm gonna click on my keyframe to bring up the curve. I'm gonna hit H so that I can see all of the keyframes. And then I'm gonna zoom out a little bit so I have a little bit more room here. And let me stop the playback. So if we look at this, what's happening is we're starting at frame 0 and we're slowly increasing the value on the X-axis, which is moving it to the right. Well, I want to anticipate that movement first. So I actually need this thing to move a little bit to the left before it moves to the right. So how would we do that? As with everything in Cinema 4D, there's 50 ways to do it. So I'm gonna show you a couple. Now, if I grab this keyframe in the graph and I try to move it a couple frames over, you'll notice it's a little too easy to move it up and down. So if you hold Shift when you're doing this, it's gonna keep the value the same, but now you can move it in time without screwing up your value. So I'm gonna go forward, let's say 3 frames here. And now what I can do is on this first frame, add another keyframe there. So with my keyframe selected, I'm gonna go into the coordinates and I'm gonna add another keyframe there, okay? So now you see I have a keyframe, another one, and then the rest of my animation. And what I'd like to do is have this keyframe be pushing this thing a little bit to the left. So let me go to that keyframe, make sure I have my keyframe selected, and then I can just come over here and I can slowly adjust this. Now, this is such a little move I need to make that it's actually really hard just clicking and dragging with my mouse to get exactly what I want. So I'm gonna hit undo. What I can do is hold Option and then click and drag within this little window here, and now I get a ton of control. It sort of slows the movement down for me. You can see the keyframe turned orange, meaning I've changed it, but I haven't yet locked it in. So I need to hit Command and click, and now I've locked it in. Now, if you look at the graph, you can see that that graph dips down a little bit. And in fact, I can zoom in here and get a better look at it. Now, there's a weird little crook in the graph here, so let's fix that. If I select these, you can see what's going on. This keyframe has 2 Bezier handles now because there's an incoming keyframe and an outgoing keyframe. And so what I wanna do is actually just adjust this Bezier handle here. So I'm gonna grab it, hold Command, and move this over. But you can see it's adjusting this one, and I don't want that. So I'm gonna hit undo, and I need to first break these Bezier handles so they're not connected and I can manipulate them separately. So there's a command right over here that will do that for you, break tangents, and you can just click on that. And now if I grab this, you'll see only this side moves. This side stays exactly where I put it. So that's great. That's something you need to be aware of, okay? Now you can see I'm trying to zoom in here really close and it's pretty finicky. So another cool command is you can select 2 keyframes and hit S, which you can also find in the frame menu here, frame selected. So H is frame all, it's gonna frame everything, and S is gonna frame only the things that are highlighted, and you can see here we are. And I can zoom in a little bit more too. So what I really want is at the beginning here, I just want a nice little ease into the anticipation keyframe, just like this. And then I want it to ease out pretty slowly. Okay, now we have a pretty stiff ease, so it looks like that's already happening. So let's just go ahead and start at frame 0 and play this and see what it looks like. And I think that helps. It's just a nice little detail. It makes it feel, I don't know, a little more natural. We can also do the exact same thing on the last keyframe. So if we go to this last keyframe, we can now add an overshoot, which is essentially just the inverse of this. It's gonna go a little too far. So I want it to go too far, and then over 3 frames, I want it to settle back into position. So I need another keyframe 3 frames after the last one. So I'm gonna show you another way that you could do this. So you could, of course, come over here, click on the object that you want, and add a keyframe and turn it on. But another way I could do it is just go to the last keyframe and then go back 1, 2, 3, hold Command and Option on my keyboard and click on the line, and you'll see it will add an extra keyframe there for me. So sometimes this is a handy way to do it. I'm gonna select both of these keyframes and I'm gonna move them 3 frames holding Shift so I don't accidentally move them up and down on the graph. And now what I wanna do is come in here to this keyframe and I'm just gonna push it up a little bit. Now you can see you gotta be really careful. Look up here as I drag this up and down, it's actually moving where that keyframe lands. And I want it to go basically all the way to the end, okay? And I want this little overshoot to be a little bit stiff. I want it to feel, I don't know, kind of clunky. So you can see that there's a triangle at the end of the Bezier handles. That means that they are linked. I need to break them. So I can adjust this one separately, okay? I can hold Command to keep it from going up and down. I can grab this one and hold Command to keep it from going up and down. And now you can see how it's a little bit stiffer than our anticipation. Let's just play this back and see what it looks like. Cool, so that's a little bit too jarring, so let's go ahead and fix that. And I think all I need to do is make sure that I'm not going up with my graph. You can see that I got a little sloppy. The Bezier handle is pointed up. I don't want that. So I'm gonna just point that down like this, make sure it's flat. And then I'm also gonna have to come over here and fix this one because otherwise it's gonna feel a little bit strange. So now that's fixed. And then what I could also do is I could just minimize the amount of the overshoot. It may be going a little too far to the right, or to soften that, I could just add a little bit more time here. And another thing I could do is go forward 2 frames from the end here, grab this keyframe and hit Command-C, Command-V to copy and paste it. Grab this keyframe and bring it down a little bit. So now what's happening is it's overshooting too far to the right, then it's coming back too far to the left, then it's settling into the final position. So now we have 2 overshoots. And if I hit H to look at the shape of the graph, you can see how we're starting to really massage this. Cool, and this is now the animation we have on this, and you can see how these little details and being really precise with timing and spacing, it gives you a little bit more of an interesting look, a little bit better feel. These are things you're gonna be playing with your entire career and getting better and better at every single time you use them. And as you're watching me do this, you're probably thinking, oh, I might do it a different way. There's like an infinite number of variations of the way you can set up your timing, your spacing, having anticipations, not having them, having overshoots, adjusting the Bezier handles. I want you to play with this. Try to touch every keyframe in the graph just a little bit. Have a point of view. It really does make your animation better. Now I want to talk about the principle of overlapping animation. And so the first way I'm going to demonstrate it is I'm going to just take this movement here, okay, these keyframes, and I'm going to copy them. I want to put them on the other keyframe. So how do we do that? So what I'm going to do is just click on keyframe 2 and put a keyframe on the X position, and then I'm going to click on keyframe 3 and put a keyframe on X position. All this is doing is basically adding those animation properties, the X position property, to my dope sheet. So now I can copy and paste keyframes between tracks. But you'll notice I'm only seeing the object that I have selected. So I want to turn off my only OM selection filter. So now I'm actually seeing animated things, and I don't have to have them selected in my object manager to be able to see them. So now you can see all three of my objects and the keyframes at the same time, which is really handy. If I click on keyframe 2's position track and I hit paste now, I can paste in those same values, and I can do the same on 3. If I now play this, they all move the same way. Now, it's kind of boring seeing them all move at the same time. And you probably already have an instinct as an animator to offset things so they don't all move at exactly the same time. If you don't, I want you to develop it. So watch what happens when I move these. So I'm gonna select keyframe 3 and 2. I'm gonna select their keyframes, and I'm gonna move them over 2 frames, okay? Then I'm gonna select just keyframe 3 and move that over 2 frames. So you can see that all I'm doing is offsetting this movement. And one of the cool things about Cinema 4D, depending on your computer, of course, is that you can manipulate keyframes and curves in real time while you're playing it back and see the result. So I want you to notice what this is doing. A, it's a little bit more interesting, but also it feels a little bit like a whipping motion, almost like a sine wave. You're gonna notice this everywhere you look in animation. Things tend to move with this sort of wave-like pattern, especially when you start offsetting things. And so this is the principle of follow-through, overlapping action, and it kind of plays into the idea of anticipations and overshoots. This wave that propagates through things, moving layers, not all at the same time, but with sort of the same underlying force. And this is just a key principle of animation. Frankly, it's my favorite one. So notice how much more interesting that looks. I'm gonna now show you how we could apply that to this little fellow over here. So let me turn off my dope sheet for a minute. Shift F3 is just gonna hide that. So let me talk about how this is set up and what this is. So what we have here is basically just like an arm with 3 joints. So if I rotate this arm on the bank property, you can see I can sort of wave it back and forth, kind of like a metronome, okay? But if I open up this object manager, you'll notice that I have 2 parented child objects within there. Now I wanna call out, and I know EJ has already mentioned this to you, there's a layers manager in Cinema 4D that's extremely useful. And so the geometry that's actually creating this, I've hidden it just for simplicity's sake. It's gonna be easier for you to see this demonstration without all this extra stuff. Just so you know, if you want, you can download this project. It'll be linked in the resources. And then you can come into the layers manager, and in the parts layer, just turn the object manager back on. And now you'll see the cylinder and the arm that makes these things up. I'm just hiding them for simplicity's sake. So what's cool about this parenting chain is I can take arm 2 and I can rotate it on the bank property, and then I can take arm 3 and I can rotate it on the bank property, and you can get this sort of joint chain. This is actually called a forward kinematic joint chain. Eventually in Cinema 4D, you're gonna get into rigging concepts, and there are 2 basic types of rigging. The simplest one is called forward kinematic, meaning basically you're gonna move things from the parent joint down to the child joint, right? So using my arm as an example, my elbow is the parent, right? And so as I rotate, everything rotates with it. Then my wrist rotates. Then my fingers rotate. We're moving forward through my bone chain, okay? Inverse kinematic, we're not gonna get into in this lesson, but just so you know what it is, and there's like a little seed planted in your brain. Inverse kinematic is where actually you control the parent chain with the end of the chain, right? So it's inverse. So you can create controller setups in Cinema 4D and other programs where instead of having to rotate this, then this, then this, you can literally have a controller where you just pull the fingers and everything moves the way it's supposed to all the way down the chain, which is really cool. I don't think you need to know that for this lesson, but I just thought it's an interesting bit of trivia. So what are we gonna do with all this? So let me hit undo so we can get back to this. So what I'm gonna do is start with ARM1 and I'm gonna put a keyframe on the bank rotation property. Then I'm gonna hit Shift F3 to bring the dope sheet back up, and let's give it a little bit more room here. I don't wanna see these keyframe objects anymore, so let me go back up to filter and turn on only object manager selection for now. And so now you can see that keyframe, and we were on frame 30 when we set it. So let me move that back to frame 0 like this. And I'll move the playhead back. And then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna set the bank on ARM1 to, I don't know, maybe something like -15. That's probably good. So let's do -15 and set that keyframe there, okay? And then I'm gonna go forward 1 second and we're gonna do 15. So all we're doing is rotating once like this, okay? Pretty simple. Now I'm gonna hit Tab to go into the F-curve editor, and this should look familiar. So you can see our curve here. It's just a standard easy ease, pretty boring. So even without looking at it, now notice I have both keyframes selected. So when I pull one, they both react in the same way. I can get more contrast out of it just like this. Let's play that and see what that looks like. Now I'm gonna want this to go back and forth. And so I could just copy and paste the keyframes and do it that way, but there's actually an even neater way in Cinema 4D to have something kind of loop back and forth. What I can do is select both of these keyframes like this. I can come up to functions, and up here where it says track after, this is where you can set the behavior of what that animation track is doing after the last keyframe. And what I would like it to do is to oscillate after. Now watch what that does. I now see a black line, and if I zoom out, you'll see that this is showing me what the animation curve is doing after the keyframe's end. It's oscillating, meaning it's going back and forth and back and forth. And what's amazing about this is if I select both of these, as I adjust the Bezier handle, you can see that it's actually adjusting the entire sequence of what happens after the keyframes are done. This is with just 2 keyframes. There are some features inside of Cinema 4D that are so clutch for animators, and I hope that you're not afraid to dig in there and try all the buttons. We are not gonna be able to explain every single feature of Cinema 4D in this class, but you should now know enough to feel comfortable experimenting and playing around and thinking, I believe this is possible, I'm gonna figure out how to do it. Let me set my playback area to 48 frames. And the reason I did that is because now you can see I have a perfect loop from the beginning of this movement to the end. And so I can hit play, and this should just go back and forth just like that. You'll notice the keyframes end because I didn't loop those, but that's okay for now. Cool, so this is just rocking back and forth, and we've got this nice little move because we put some nice spacing on there. Now, what about these other arms? Well, here's what I wanna do. I wanna go back to my dope sheet, and I'm gonna select these keyframes. I'm gonna do the same thing I did before. I'm gonna go to ARM2 and put a keyframe on bank. I'm gonna go to ARM3, I'm gonna put a keyframe on bank, and then I just wanna see the arms and manipulate the keyframes and the graphs for those. How can I do that? Well, I can select all 3 of them like this, and because they're all selected, I can see all of them, but I can adjust all of them individually in the timeline, which is really nice. And now just so things are clearer, I can click on these little plus icons to open up the actual animation tracks that we're working with here, which is rotation, bank. So you can see that there's a keyframe here on rotation bank on the first part of the arm. So I'm gonna copy that. I'm gonna go down to this track for arm 2 and hit paste. And then I'm gonna go to track 3 and hit paste. So there we go. As this thing moves, you can see that they all bend the same way. They all bend in the same direction, okay? Now you'll notice also that when arm 1 bends back, arm 2 and 3 don't bend back. So if I hit tab and then I select all of these animation tracks to bring up their curves, you'll notice right away what's going on. We set the loop behavior of arm 1 to just continually oscillate back and forth. We need to do the same thing with arm 2 and arm 3. So I'm gonna go into functions, track after, and I'm gonna say oscillate after, and then I'm gonna do the same thing on arm 3. So select it, make sure you select all the keyframes, and then go to functions, track after, oscillate after. Cool. So now we have these things oscillating back and forth. Here's arm 1, okay? If I go to frame 24 and I click on arm 2, you'll see that we have a little bit of a different setup here. So because I didn't copy the first keyframe, this keyframe is not in the right spot. It's at 0 degrees when it should actually be at -15 degrees. So another way I can change this is literally double clicking on the keyframe and typing in -15, just like that. And then I can sort of manually adjust this Bezier handle to try and get symmetry between both sides of the animation. Then I'm gonna do the same thing on arm 3. I'm gonna double click, I'm gonna make this -15, grab the Bezier handle, I'm holding Command, and there we go. Now, if I play this, you'll see we get this interesting waving back and forth movement. Okay, so we've done a lot of work to get essentially a wacky waving inflatable arm tube band sort of thing, right? What we have is not yet overlapping animation. To get that, we need the keyframes to overlap in time. Remember, when I move my arm, my elbow rotates first, then my wrist. There's a lag. And it may seem like a subtle distinction. It's really, really crucial. It completely changes the way the animation feels. So let's apply that now. If I have all 3 of these selected, you can see right now the graphs are all in exactly the same place. So let's hit Tab. And what I want is arm 1 to move first, then arm 2. So I'm gonna click on arm 2 and I'm gonna move all of the keyframes forward 2 frames. Then I'm gonna click on arm 3, move all the keyframes forward 2 frames. If I select all the keyframes and hit Tab, you can see now we've got these overlapping graphs. And when I play it, notice how different it looks. It looks like the top of it, the tip, it's delayed from the base, right? And that gives it this really cool kind of natural feel to it. I'm gonna hit Shift F3 to close my dope sheet so you can see this a little bit better. And I want you to notice how big of a difference it made just to offset things a few frames. What happens if we offset them even more? So let me select the arms again. And it's really easy. Again, I can just come in here, click arm 2, and why don't we do 2 more frames? So now we're offsetting each of these by 4 frames from its parent. Now I can hit Tab and I can play this back. Now we don't have a seamless loop anymore, but I want you to notice when this moves to the right, look how much delay there is between the bottom piece finishing its move and the top piece. And that's what gives it that really cool kind of fluid feel. You can imagine if we had 10 segments of this thing, not just 3, and they were offset by like 6 frames each, you would get this crazy, really fluid, loose feeling follow through. And you can play with the amount of frames between each segment that moves. You can play with having different amounts of rotation between each segment. The base may rotate more than the tip, for example. And all of these variables are going to give you totally different feelings of rubberiness or stiffness, and these are really useful animation tools. So just to finish this off, I'm gonna click on my keyframe objects here so I can see all 3 of them. I'm gonna grab all of their keyframes. I'm gonna hit H just so you can see how these look in our graph editor. And then I'm gonna go to Functions, Track After, and I'm gonna do the same thing, Oscillate After. So now they just go back and forth. And what's really cool is that you'll notice even the overshoot at the end here gets played backwards. Now it doesn't work perfectly, but it is kind of a neat looking effect. And hopefully this gives you ideas for how you can use simple animation principles in Cinema 4D to create things that loop seamlessly, that have a lot of character, a lot of feel. And basically little exercises like this are really great ways to develop your sense of timing and spacing and animation in general. Your most valuable asset as an animator, doesn't matter if it's 2D or 3D, is your eye. It's your ability to look at something and know what needs to change to make it stronger, to get better feel out of it, or to know if it's good in the first place. And so learning animation principles, I think, is one of the most important investments you can make in yourself as a motion designer. You're getting into the world of 3D by taking this class, and it's a giant rabbit hole, as you're finding out. There's lighting, and there's camera, and there's texturing, and there's modeling, and there's animation. And within animation, you've got animation principles, and you've got character animation, which is kind of its own thing. And then you've got design. And hopefully this is exciting to you, because there's basically an unlimited amount of knowledge out there for you to learn, to apply. I really hope that we can help you at School of Motion to, pursue as many goals as you want to and to learn as many skills as you can. And I hope that this just whet your appetite a little bit for learning more about animation. You've now learned about timing, spacing, you've had a little bit of a recap on anticipation, you've learned about overshoots, and I dove in a little bit into the idea of follow through. It's a much deeper topic actually. And there's a lot of really cool tools inside of Cinema 4D that it can even do some of these things automatically for you. There's deformers that will do things for you like squash and stretch somewhat automatically. Hopefully you're excited to learn about all that. I hope EJ is kicking your butt and you're getting more and more comfortable with Cinema 4D each day. And I really hope that you continue your animation journey after this class. So that's it for me. I hope you learned something. Enjoy the rest of Basecamp.